Let's start with a prayer. Lord, we come before you with such thanksgiving for this beautiful fall weather that we're having, and it's going to be even cooler next week, and we are so in need of some cool breezes. Thank you for that, and thank you for surrounding us with blessings and sunshine and just joy in meeting other people. We ask that you be with us today in this class and direct us to learn what you would have us. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, as we said, today is Daniel in the lion's den. And first we're going to start with just a little bit of a background of the story. The Holy Land had been laid waste, and it looked like God had abandoned his people. The temple, which was designated as the center for proper worship of God and meant to be a light to all the other nations, had been destroyed by the conquering armies of the Babylonian Empire. Now, almost all of the people of Judah had been either killed or exiled to Babylon. The northern kingdom of Israel had been wiped out and scattered by Assyria more than a century earlier. But all was not lost for God's people. Even in exile, there were those who loved God and were loyal to him. The prophets Ezekiel and Daniel are great examples of people who continued to serve God faithfully while they lived in Babylon. Ezekiel brought messages of hope and restoration, and Daniel, well, he was a bright, shining example of righteousness in the midst of a pagan nation. God protected and preserved this remnant of his people, even when their Babylonian captors were destroyed by the incoming rising Persian Empire. Now, Daniel served as a prophet to the exiles in Babylon from 605 to 536 BC. He was a man of prayer and a statesman with a gift of prophecy. The Babylonians treated all their exiles very well. They could meet freely. They could buy property and practice their own customs and religion. The later archives of a commercial bank at Nippur show that within little more than a century, some of the exiles had become quite prosperous. And then this is quite different than most countries when they brought in people that they had kept captives. Those people were slaves. But Babylonia did not do that. The exiles, naturally enough, were influenced by Babylonian culture. They adopted the Aramaic language and alphabet and the Mesopotamian calendar. And many people took Babylonian names, just like immigrants to this country would Americanize their names frequently. At the same time, they tried to retain their national identity. They would attach special importance to practices such as circumcision, dietary laws, and the Sabbath observance. When Cyrus of Persia, conqueror of the Medes, took Babylon in 539 BC, the Jews' long exile there would come to an end. They would be free to return to Jerusalem, although few, it seems, did so immediately. So that gives you a little background on what was happening prior to today's lesson.
King Darius reorganized his kingdom. He appointed 120 governors to administer all the parts of his realm. Over them were 3 vice-regents, one of whom was Daniel.
Daniel was just a boy when the Babylonian troops started to comb his city for the best and the brightest. He was taken from his home and his family, and he was given a new name and placed in a Babylonian school for boys. Over the next few years, Daniel was given instruction in the Chaldean language, and he was taught how to write in the wedge-shaped cuneiform script. He was taught how to count, how to dress, how to bow, and how to behave himself in the court of the king. Then Daniel would have received special training in the Babylonian arts of war, hunting, and leisure. Daniel must have shown an incredible interest in the stars because he also was given classes in astrology and magic. Now the Persians had conquered Babylon while the Jews were in exile there. And at that time, Daniel was now over 80 years old. He was one of Darius's top 3 administrators. Daniel was working with those who did not believe in his God, but he worked more efficiently and capably than all the rest. Thus, he attracted the attention of the pagan king, and he earned a special place of respect. Earlier in Daniel, we are told by another king, "I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom." One of the best ways we have to influence non-Christian employers is to work diligently and responsibly. How well do you represent God to your employer and fellow workers? Daniel's superiors had long recognized his integrity, and he became a mainstay of the royal court. Daniel served as a trusted advisor in the courts of Babylonian kings for more than 40 years, and in the court of the conquering Persian king Darius after that.
The 120 governors reported to the 3 vice regents who made sure that everything was in order for the king. But Daniel, bringing with spirit and intelligence, so completely outclassed the other vice regents and governor that the king decided to put him in charge of the whole kingdom.
The same thing had happened to Daniel in Babylon before the Medes and Persians had conquered the country. We're told earlier in the book of Daniel, then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. And then later, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was dressed in purple robes, a golden chain was hung around his neck, and he was proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. Also, we're told, this man Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, has exceptional ability and is filled with a divine knowledge and understanding. He can interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means.
The vice regents and governors got together to find some old scandal or skeleton in Daniel's life that they could use against him, but they couldn't dig up anything. He was totally exemplary and trustworthy. They could find no evidence of negligence or misconduct. So they finally gave up and said, we're never going to find anything against this Daniel unless we cook something up religious.
Now Daniel made enemies at work by doing a good job. Now perhaps you've had similar experience. When you began to excel, you'll find that co-workers may look for ways to hold you back and tear you down. How should we deal with those who would cheer our downfall and even try to hasten it? We need to simply conduct our whole life above reproach. Then you will have nothing to hide, and your enemies will have a difficult time finding legitimate charges against you. Now, of course, this will not always save you from attacks. And like Daniel, you will have to rely on God for protection. Philippians 2:15 says, so that no one can criticize you, live clean, innocent lives as children of God, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people. And Jeremiah 20 says, I hear many whispering, terror on every side. Denounce him, let's denounce him. All my friends are waiting for me to slip, saying, perhaps he will be deceived. Then we will prevail over him and take our revenge on him. The jealous officials could not find anything about Daniel's life to criticize, so they attacked his religion. If you face jealous critics because of your faith, be glad that they're criticizing that part of your life. Perhaps they had to focus on your religion as a last resort. Respond by continuing to believe and live as you should. Then remember that God is in control, fighting this battle for you. Jesus was put in that very same situation as Daniel was. Luke 20 tells us, keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said, so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. And then, just a few verses later, they were unable to trap him in what he had said there in public. And astounded by his answer, they became silent.
The vice regents and governors conspired together and then went to the king and said, King Darius, live forever. We've convened your vice regents, governors, and all your leading officials and have agreed that the king should issue the following decree. For the next 30 days, no one is to pray to any god or mortal except you, O king. Anyone who disobeys will be thrown into the lion's den. Issue this decree, O king, and make it unconditional, as if in stone, like all the laws of the Medes and the Persians. King Darius signed the decree.
Now the phrase that they used in this verse, O king, live forever, that was the usual way of addressing the king at that time. And just as we find earlier in the book of Daniel, then the astrologers answer the king, may the king live forever. Now, I don't know if they really felt that way and they just said it, but, it made them look good and so it worked. Now, as King Darius is approached, he's told that all of his officials have agreed on a decree that should be issued proclaiming that no one should pray to any god or mortal for the next 30 days except to the king. These guys are good. In one fell swoop, they've managed to make Daniel a part of the snare that will trap him and brutally end his life. Psalm 59:3 says, they have set an ambush for me. Fierce enemies are out there waiting. Lord, though I have not sinned or offended them. And in Psalm 67 verse 4, surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. In Babylon, the king's word was the law. In the Medo-Persian Empire, however, when a law was made, even the king could not change it. There was no do-overs. Darius was an effective government administrator, but he had a fatal flaw, his pride. By appealing to his vanity, the men talked King Darius into signing a law, effectively making himself a god for the next 30 days. This law could not be broken, even by another important official, like Daniel was. It was written in stone. The concept was noted in the Old Testament books of Esther and here in Daniel. A tradition going as far back as the 18th century BC recognized that a judge could not change a decision that he had made. Certainly no lower official could countermand the decree of the Persian king, and the king himself might have thought it too humiliating to go back and reconsider something he had already decreed. Because you know those kings, they're always right, aren't they? We know people in charge, they don't make mistakes. The royal code of honor would have made it out of the question for the king to rescind an order. In the book of Esther, we're told the decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. The content and implication of this decree has caused a lot of debate among scholars. There's no evidence that Persian kings were ever inclined to deify themselves. So this leads some to suggest that the decree simply made the king the sole representative of the deity for the next 30 days. All prayers to God or the gods would need to be channeled through him. But there is no consensus by scholars as to which opinion is the correct one.
When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed and posted, he continued to pray just as he had always done. His house had windows in the upstairs that opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he knelt there in prayer, thanking and praising his God.
Daniel made absolutely no attempt to hide his daily prayer routine from his enemies or from the government, even though he knew he would be disobeying this new law. Hiding his daily prayers would have been futile because surely the conspirators would not have given up until they found something else to charge Daniel with. Also, hiding would have demonstrated that he was afraid of the other government officials. Daniel continued to pray because he could not look to the king for the guidance and strength that he needed during this difficult time. Only God could provide what he really needed. Now, Philippians 4, verse 6 reminds us, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Daniel had a very disciplined prayer life. Thankfully, our prayers are not usually interrupted by threats. It's often the pressure of everyday life and our schedules that cause our prayers to be delayed. We need to remember not to let threats or pressures cut into our prayer time. We need to pray regularly, no matter what, for prayer is our lifeline to God. The practice of praying facing the temple in Jerusalem is mentioned only twice in the Old Testament. It's mentioned in 1 Kings 8 when it says, "When your people go to war against their enemies, wherever you send them, and when they pray to the Lord toward the city you have chosen and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause." And it's mentioned in Psalm 5, verse 7. "But I, by your great love, can come into your house in reverence. I bow down toward your holy temple." Now we're told that he prayed 3 times a day. Sounds like a dentist's orders about brushing your teeth, doesn't it? This seems to suggest that the Jews in exile had developed some sort of a fixed hour of prayer. And they may have taken this from the temple's sacrificial hours as their model. Psalm 55:17 says, "Morning, noon, and night, I cry out in my distress, and the Lord hears my prayers." After the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Jews continued to pray 3 times a day as Daniel had modeled. Daniel's practice of kneeling in prayer probably reflects another custom that grew up among the Jewish exiles. Psalm 95:6 says, "Come, let us bow down in worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker."
The conspirators came and found him praying, asking God for help. They went straight to the king and reminded him of the royal decree that he had signed. "Did you not," they say, "sign a decree forbidding anyone to pray to any god or man except you for the next 30 days? And anyone caught doing it would be thrown into the lion's den." "Absolutely," said the king, "written in stone, like all the laws of the Medes and Persians."
Daniel did not even wait for the inevitable plans of the conspirators to fall into place. He got down on his knees and he prayed to the one who would and could help him in any situation. Psalm 37 says, "The wicked lie in wait for the righteous, intent on putting them to death. But the Lord will not leave them in the power of the wicked, or let them be condemned when brought to trial." This wasn't the first time that Daniel had experienced others working to defeat him and his fellow Jews. During the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, a large statue had been erected that everyone was supposed to fall down and worship every time they heard the sound of certain musical instruments playing. When Daniel's 3 friends refused to obey, they were thrown into the fiery furnace, but God protected them and they survived.
Then they said, Daniel, one of the Jewish exiles, ignored you, O king, and defies your decree. 3 times a day he prays.
They're just like little tattletales, aren't they? This wasn't the first time either that Daniel had been brought before a king. We're told earlier in the book, so Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king asked him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles brought from Judah by my predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar?" How sad that the only crime the conspirators could convict Daniel with was praying to God. Did they think that Daniel's God was as weak and useless as theirs? Well, they were in for a big surprise.
At this, the king was very upset and tried his best to get Daniel out of the fix we put him in. He worked at it the whole day long.
And this wasn't the first time that a king found himself trying desperately to undo something others had urged him to do. We're told in the book of Mark, chapter 6, "Then the king deeply regretted what he had said, but because of the vows he had made in front of his guests, he could not refuse her." Now, given that Persian rulers had a very tolerant attitude toward the religions of their subject peoples, King Darius probably intended this decree to simply apply to the Persian population alone. But Daniel ran afoul of it because he was a very senior Persian official. So King Darius realized that he had been tricked by his advisors. But there was just no way to get around the decree that had been announced to all the people. No matter how esteemed Daniel was by him, there was just simply nothing he could do to get him out of this fix.
But then the conspirators were back. "Remember, O king, it's the law of the Medes and Persians that the king's decree can never be changed."
You know, this is just like having a little brother or sister, who just so enjoys tattling and getting you in trouble. And, "Remember, you said this, Mom." Not that I know, but I've heard other people say this. The conspirators were right. This decree could not be rescinded. They had very neatly put the king in a position without any options. Daniel would pay the price for the king's earlier willingness to be worshipped. But this wasn't the only time a king found himself in a tight spot. In the book of Esther, we're told, "Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring can never be revoked." And in Psalm 94, verse 20, "Can a corrupt throne be allied with you, a throne that brings misery by its decrees?"
The king caved in and ordered Daniel brought and thrown into the lion's den. But he said to Daniel, "Your God, to whom you are so loyal, is going to get you out of this."
Even unbelievers witnessed Daniel's consistency. By his continual service, Daniel had demonstrated his faithful devotion to God. What can unbelievers determine about your life? We're given assurance in Psalm 37:40. The Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. King Darius was between a rock and a hard place. Daniel had been a trusted advisor, and he had been such a great administrator, and the king depended on him in so many different ways. On one hand, he wanted to do everything he could to keep Daniel out of the lion's den. On the other hand, he was bound by a decree that he simply could not change. In 2 Samuel 3, we're told, "And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and the sons of Z are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." Looking at the expectant faces of the conspirators, King Darius gave in to their relentless demands. Daniel was arrested and taken to the lion's den for his execution. Now, lions roamed the countryside and the forests in Mesopotamia, and the people feared them and greatly respected their power. Some kings even hunted lions for sport. Since the lions were so sly, tracking them could cover many miles and take quite a few days. So, preferring to hunt on their own schedules instead of waiting on the lions, the Assyrians began keeping wild animals in kennels. On the day of a hunt, the prey would be selected and released. This became popular in many kingdoms, including the kingdom of Babylonia. The Persians captured lions, keeping them in large parks where they were fed and attended to. Lions were also used for executing people. That's why King Darius had a den of lions nearby on the premises in which to throw Daniel. But God has ways of delivering his people that none of us can even imagine. It's always premature to give up and give in to the pressure of unbelievers, because God has a power they know nothing about. God can even shut the lion's mouth.
A stone slab was placed over the opening of the den. The king sealed the cover with a signet ring, and the signet ring of all his nobles, fixing Daniel's fate.
The Aramaic word used for den means pit. And the pit in this story seems to be an underground cavity with a relatively small hole at the top that could be covered by a large stone. And although this particular form of punishment is not mentioned elsewhere in earlier Assyrian texts, we do know that oath breakers were put into cages of wild animals that were set up in the city square so they could be devoured in public. Persian kings were known to use some horrible forms of execution. There were three kinds of seals in use in the ancient Near East. There were cylinder seals, stamp seals, and signet rings. The signet ring tended to be used for more personal business. The stone closing the pit, we're told, was to be sealed in some way with several different sets of seals to prevent it being tampered with in the night. Now, possibly a cord or cloth or both were fastened across the rock using clay into which the seals were impressed. In Matthew 27, we're told, so they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting the guard. Signets were a type of seal worn either as a ring or on a cord around the neck, and they were used to leave impressions in clay or in wax. The impression functioned as your signature to authorize or authenticate a document or to indicate that something had been sealed shut by the signet's owner. You never had to worry about a doctor's writing on a prescription. They used their signet ring, so that was nice and clear. See, sometimes they did things better in the old days, didn't they? The use of signet rings and cylinder seals is known from the earliest times. In the book of Genesis, we're told the Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Rulers gave signet rings to individuals as signs of high office and to enable them to implement official business. This was like having your own notary with you at all times. But poor old Daniel now found himself on the wrong side of a stone slab, facing a captive pride of lions.
The king then went back to his palace. He refused supper. He couldn't sleep. He spent the night fasting.
Was this the first time in his life that King Darius had to face the consequences of his actions? His vanity was going to cause Daniel to lose his life. He had tried to encourage Daniel by saying, "Your God, to whom you are so loyal, is going to get you out of this. I just know he will." But if he didn't believe it, was it possible that Daniel could? The king spent the night pacing the floor. While sleep was impossible, it was easy to fast because he had no appetite for food. Would this show the gods how sincere he was, that Daniel be delivered from his fate? Psalm 77 tells us, "You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak."
At daybreak, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. As he approached the den, he called out anxiously, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve so loyally, saved you from the lions?"
The king anxiously awaited the very first light of dawn so that he could hurry to the lion's den to discover Daniel's fate. Was there any chance that he could be alive? The king called out, acknowledging Daniel's faith, but he really did not expect to hear an answer. If the king had known the living God, he would not have spent a tortured night alone. Genesis 18:14 says, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." And in Numbers 11:23, then the Lord said to Moses, "Has my arm lost its power? Now you will see whether or not my words come true." And in Jeremiah 32:17, O sovereign Lord, you made the heavens and earth by your strong hand and powerful arm. Nothing is too hard for you.
O king, live forever, said Daniel. My God sent his angel, who closed the mouths of the lions so that they would not hurt me. I've been found innocent before God and also before you, O king. I've done nothing to harm you.
All night long, Daniel had prayed, and when the morning light came, he was not touched. The person who trusts in God and obeys his will is untouchable. To trust God is to have immeasurable peace. God, who had delivered Daniel, will deliver each one of us in our troubles. Do you trust him with your life? Psalm 91:11 says, "For he will order his angels to protect you wherever you go." That is a promise from him to each one of us. And in Acts 12:17, Peter finally came to his senses. "It's really true," he said. "The Lord has sent his angel and saved me from Herod and from what the Jewish leaders had planned to do to me."
When the king heard these words, he was happy. He ordered Daniel taken up out of the den. When he was hauled up, there wasn't a scratch on him. He had trusted his God.
The king could not believe his ears. Was that really Daniel talking to him? Or was he just imagining his voice because he truly somehow wanted him to be miraculously delivered? As Daniel was raised up from the lion's den, the king turned him around and around looking for injuries, but there weren't any. Daniel had prayed and trusted in the Lord to take care of him, and God did. In 1 Chronicles 5:20, we're told he answered their prayers because they trusted in him. And in 2 Chronicles, believe in the Lord your God, and you will be able to stand firm. And Psalm 118:8 says, "It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans." And ain't that the truth?
Then the king commanded the conspirators who had informed him on Daniel being thrown in the lion's den, along with their wives and children. Before they hit the floor, the lions had them in their jaws, tearing them to pieces. Yeah.
Now, in accordance with Persian customs, this very cruel punishment was transferred to those who had conspired against the king by provoking him into an unjust action. In Deuteronomy 19, we're told if the accuser has brought false charges against his fellow Israelite, you must impose on the accuser the sentence he intended for the other person. In this way, you will purge such evil from among you. Now, this was not a false accusation against Daniel. Daniel had broken the law, but this was the custom of what happened. So the king's great anger resulted in the execution of the evil officials, their wives, and their children. Evil deeds often backfire on those who plan cruelty. It was the Persian custom for a man's family to share in his guilt. In the book of Esther, we're told, Haman, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire. And Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was an unusually severe form of punishment. History tells us that when a high-ranking official and close associate of King Darius I was judged guilty of revolt against him, Darius had most of the man's family executed with him. It would also be logical that the king would not want to leave any family members of the executed alive to incite rebellion or conspire against him.
King Darius published this proclamation to every race, color, and creed on earth. Peace to you, abundant peace. I decree that Daniel's God shall be worshipped and feared in all parts of my kingdom. He is the living God, world without end. His kingdom never falls. His rule continues eternally. He is a savior and rescuer. He performs astonishing miracles in heaven and on earth. He saved Daniel from the power of the lions.
King Nebuchadnezzar had come to believe that Israel's God was real because of the faithfulness of Daniel and his friends. Here now, Darius was also convinced of God's power because Daniel was faithful and God rescued him. Although Daniel was captive in a strange land, his devotion to God was a testimony to powerful rulers. If you find yourself in new surroundings, take the opportunity to testify about God's power in your life. Be faithful to God so that He can use you to make an impact on others. Earlier in Daniel, we read how the king came to fear God. We're told, "Therefore I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." And also earlier in Daniel, how great are his signs, how powerful his wonders. His kingdom will last forever, his rule through all generations.
From then on, Daniel was treated well during the reign of Darius, and also in the following reign of Cyrus the Persian.
We're told earlier in Daniel that Daniel remained in royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. When King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon, he allowed all of the Israelites to return to the Holy Land if that was their choice. And 2 Chronicles 36 tells us, "This is what the king of Persia says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has appointed me to build him a temple at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any of you who are his people may go there for this task, and may the Lord your God be with you." Now that is where our story of Daniel for today ends, but I have a few final thoughts. An earthquake shakes the foundations of our security. A tornado blows away a lifetime of treasures that we've collected. An assassin's bullet changes national history. A drunk driver claims an innocent victim. A divorce shatters a home. International and personal tragedies make our world seem a fearful place, overflowing with evil and seemingly out of control. The litany of bombings, coups, murders, and natural disasters could cause us to think that God is absent or impotent. Where is God? We cry, engulfed by our sorrow and despair. 25 centuries ago, Daniel could have despaired. He and thousands of his countrymen had been deported to a foreign land after Judah had been conquered. Daniel found himself facing an egocentric despot and surrounded by idolaters. But instead of giving up or giving in, this courageous young man held fast to his faith in God. Daniel knew that despite the circumstances, God was sovereign and he was working out his plan for the nations and the individuals. God worked with and through Daniel as he held prominent positions in the Babylonian governments of King Nebuchadnezzar and his successor, King Belshazzar. When Babylonia fell to the Medes and Persians, Daniel became one of King Darius's most trusted advisors. God is our supreme ruler. He was in control in Babylon, and he has been moving throughout history, controlling the destinies of people ever since. And he is here now. Despite news reports or personal stress, we can always be confident that God is in control. We may not know his plan right now. We don't see the big picture, but God knows, and he will take care of us. That is his promise to us. If we are faithful to him, he will be faithful to us. There's a lot more that's going on with Daniel, the whole book of Daniel. How many in this class are taking Pastor Jeff's class for Daniel? So you're hearing, there was incidents before this, there's things that happened, but this is just one little segment of Daniel's story. Are there any questions about today's lesson? Roxy?
On page 85 with the scripture from Daniel 3:29 about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And after that, the king said that there's no other God, and the rest be like this. And if anyone, whatever their race or nation, speak with the word against God, okay, so in other words, the living God. Wasn't that incident before Daniel?
Yes, yes.
So,
these Bible verses that I intersperse in the lesson.
What I'm thinking is, there was already a rule by a king that no one could speak a word against a God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And now these guys came to him and said, make this new law.
Because that was a different king.
Yeah. So each king, it didn't go back to the last king. The laws of the last king.
Not necessarily, no. A new king comes in, it's a whole new ball game.
I didn't understand why you would say, well, I can't do that because they already have.
But that's a very good question. Thank you for that. Other questions?
That was an interesting point because in our country we have a constitution.
Yeah.
Where in this case it was always ruled
And just that, nothing.
All right, well, I have a question for you. How did Daniel's accusers know that Daniel wasn't praying to the king, that he was praying to his God? How did they know? Does anybody have an idea? Back then, prayer was always out loud. They did not pray quietly like we do.
When she went to the temple and was accused of being drunk, and she wanted to pray for me.
Hannah?
And all that.
Yeah.
So she was praying out loud too.
Yes, exactly. But prayer was always out loud. And so when he prayed, he was praying out loud to his God, and he was not praying to the king. And I would assume that at that time, people gathered to pray to the king together. And Daniel wasn't doing that. He was in his room, but he was in the window where people could see him. He wasn't hiding what he was doing. But that's why. Okay, here's another one. What do you think of the accusers' families being executed along with them? And why do you think that was? Was it just because so there was no revenge on the part of the families against the king, or was there any other reason why they were executed.
That's what they said. That's what they were.
Oh,
I think it was part of that, but I think also to show other people that you don't do false things or you don't get out of line. Because if you do, your family will also be persecuted.
so there's a bigger penalty than just you. Ellie?
No, I was going to say similar, but I'm surprised there were any people on the earth. Everybody was being killed off because somebody was bad.
Well, this wasn't the common, this was if something happened specifically that involved the king.
Well, I know, but if it's a whole family, some of those families are really big. It just
Yeah?
wonder if they're.
Well, I mean, look at the genocide that goes on in this day and age, and there's still lots of people here on the earth. I wonder, though, besides all of these reasons, and I agree with what you all say, do you think that we have a responsibility if our spouse is doing something in bad faith? Do we have a responsibility to say something to our spouse? And well, we usually know what our spouse is up to. Not always, but, and I'm not saying that, but we do. And a lot of times, we say, well, do what you want. I don't agree with you, but do what you want. But we have a responsibility, and God gives us that responsibility that if we see somebody close to us who's going down the wrong path, we need to say something to them. We don't have to be accusatory and say, you're going to burn in hell. But we can go and talk gently with them and say, have you thought about this? Are you sure this is the way you want to handle this? We can do that. And when we don't, we then share in their guilt. And I think that's another part.
That addresses the spouse, but that addresses throwing the kids in.
The kids? Well, nobody wants to take care of the kids, Dave. No. I think that goes more for the revenge part, where they don't want the kids to grow up and then, go in.
Style you use, though, of asking questions.
Can you speak up a little bit?
The style you use of using a question engages that other person to think. But you still need to think about the phrasing and the optics of your question. But I once worked in a very male-dominant situation where I was the only female. Of course, my voice was never heard. And I struggled with that. I went to Dale Carnegie. I did a number of things to try and make that happen. I stumbled upon this book called Smart Questions. And I learned from that when you're trying to evoke thought from someone, instead of casting the accusation at them, think about a question that will it's going to lay in their brain, it's going to toil there for a while.
Yes. Very good. Thank you. Thank you. That is exactly a perfect way of discussing something with somebody else. Even it doesn't have to be a spouse, it can be a friend or whatever. Do you think, as an Israelite who had been captive by the Babylonians, do you think Daniel should have worked for his oppressors? Do you think that was a good thing or a bad thing?
And Joseph did. Right? Joseph?
Yes, but we're not talking about Joseph. We're talking about, no, as Daniel think about this. China comes in, invades the United States, and takes our best and brightest back to China. Do you go and work for the Chinese premier, knowing that whatever you do is going to make that country bigger and better, or do you choose not to?
Wasn't Daniel taken as a child?
He was taken as a child, not, a little bitty child, but, he was probably 12, 14, something like that when he was taken.
But maybe his influence to his,
Yeah.
So his influence, so,
he could change them.
And maybe it was his whole family, was taken, so it was just more than he as a young man. We can't say, but I think that probably if the whole family went, mom and dad, maybe the grandparents or whatever, so there was more to think of than just himself in boys' school and then, going forward.
But they were treating them good too. It wasn't like it was a hostile, they weren't in a hostile environment.
yes.
By example. He showed the example of
He continued to live his faith. How easy do you think that was for Daniel? I mean, he was totally indoctrinated in their culture, and he went to all these special schools and everything, and he started as a boy, so it wasn't like he was already an adult and he had he had formed his opinions and his core values. He was learning them. And so he was constantly exposed to them as he was growing up. How do you think he was able to maintain his adherence to God?
divine intervention.
Yeah, I think God had a special hand on him and really strengthened him. But it wasn't just God, because we're told, Daniel prayed 3 times a day. God and his dentist were both very happy with Daniel, He did what he was supposed to. We always, we get busy, life is so hectic, and we go, oh, I just didn't have time to do my devotions this morning. I'll do them when I get home from work or when I'm done running these errands. And then we get home, I got to make dinner, I have to return a phone call, and I'm just going to sit down with my husband and watch a little TV, and now it's time to go to bed. I'm exhausted. I'll do 2 devotions tomorrow. Well, we all know how that goes. Life gets busy. But Daniel, no matter what, and as one of the king's top officials, he was super busy. He didn't work a 9 to 5 day. He had things going all the time, but he took time 3 times a day to pray to God. That was important. That was a priority. And that's something that I think that we should work toward. We should strive, if we're not there. Some of you may be, and if you are, I commend you, because I'm not nearly as perfect as Daniel would be. I'd like to be, but I'm not. Oh, I forgot to give you your little, this is my Roxy cartoon. Roxy is my favorite cat lady. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Just a comment.
Sure.
One day I did that. I thought I have things to do, I'm preparing for this and that, and I'll let it sit. And tomorrow I'll do 2. Well, that day, this is at our Michigan home. I don't want to cast any cloud here. But I was in a book club, and a discussion, and I was leading the discussion, and I answered the question, or I dealt with it in my best way. The lesson learned was, when I went home and I did my Bible study, had I done my Bible study the day that I was committed to do it, I would have had scriptural response versus what I gave was just a heartfelt, friendly type of response. So the Lord showed me there with shame to myself that I need to read it daily because he uses us as individual little agents here on earth, and we need to be prepared.
That is an excellent comment. Thank you. Yes. Okay, well, let's close with, I'm going to close with a prayer that I took from Ephesians 3. I pray that Christ may live in your hearts by faith. I pray that you will be filled with love. I pray that you will be able to understand how wide and how long and how high and how deep his love is. Amen. Have a wonderful week ahead of you. Next week is our very last lesson.